She didn't know that the 6-year-old boy clinging to her back in the darkness, trembling so hard his teeth rattled, would one day make generals bow and crime lords beg. She didn't know that the small hands gripping her shoulders as she carried him through a hidden servant passage while blood soaked the marble floors behind them would grow into the most feared hands in all of Seoul. She didn't know that the promise she whispered into his hair that night, a promise made to a dying woman and a terrified child, would cost her everything she had. And she didn't know that 20 years later, when men came for her in the dark, that same boy would burn the city down to bring her back. Welcome to Unfold Korean Stories, besties. Please like, share, and subscribe telling me where you are watching from. Her name was Rachel Adiazobi, and she arrived in Seoul on a Tuesday morning in late October, 24 years old, with one hard-shell suitcase, a folder of employment papers, and the particular kind of courage that only comes from having absolutely nothing left to lose. Lagos had given her everything it could and then taken most of it back. Her father's debts. Her mother's illness. The scholarship that collapsed when the university restructured. Seoul was not a dream. It was a calculation. The employment agency had matched her with a household in Songbukdong, one of Seoul's quieter wealthy neighborhoods, the kind where the houses sat behind high stone walls and the neighbors never spoke to each other. The kind of neighborhood that did not appear in tourist photographs. She had been told the family was prominent. She had not been told the rest. The gate was iron, tall, and cold to the touch when she pressed her fingers against it that first morning. A camera blinked red above the intercom. She stated her name and waited, her breath visible in the autumn air. The gate opened without a word. That was the first sign she did not yet know to read. The interview was conducted by a woman named Madame Su-Yen Min, and Rachel understood within the first 3 minutes that this was not a woman who made small talk. She was perhaps 40, elegantly thin, wearing a cream hanbok with gold thread at the cuffs, and she had eyes that catalogued everything they touched. She asked Rachel 37 questions over the course of 90 minutes. Rachel counted. She asked about Rachel's family history, her education, her beliefs about loyalty, her understanding of discretion. She asked whether Rachel had ever spoken about an employer's private matters to a third party. Rachel said no. Madame Su-Yen Min was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, "You will be required to sign an agreement. The terms are strict. The compensation is generous. Do you want to know why?" Rachel met her gaze and said, "Yes, madam." The older woman's expression shifted by the smallest margin, something that was almost respect. "Because in this house, what is seen stays inside these walls. Forever. Do you understand what I am telling you?" Rachel understood that she was being told something very serious in extremely careful language. She said yes. She signed the papers. She moved her suitcase into the room beside the kitchen and never moved it out again. It took her 3 months to understand fully who the one family was. Not because the signs were hidden, exactly, but because she had spent her whole life learning that the safest knowledge was the knowledge you pretended not to have. Men came and went from the study at hours that had nothing to do with business meetings. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms and resumed the moment she left. The security at the gate was not the ordinary kind. One evening she overheard the words "Chonk the Syndicate" spoken between 2 men in the hallway, and she filed the name somewhere deep and quiet inside herself and never took it out unless she was alone. She was good at her work. Quietly, precisely, invisibly good. She learned which tea Madame Su-Yen Min preferred when she had a headache and which temperature the house needed to be before the master of the house, a man she knew only as Director 1, could sleep. She learned every routine, every preference, every unspoken tension in that household the way you learn a language not by studying it but by living inside it until it becomes yours. And slowly, carefully, the house began to trust her. The following year, Madame Su-Yen Min became pregnant. Rachel was the first person in the household to notice, not because she was told but because she paid attention to things other people considered too small to matter. She noticed the change in the madam's tea preference and the way she pressed one hand against her abdomen sometimes when she thought no one was looking. She said nothing. She simply began preparing the right foods without being asked and adjusting the temperature in the madam's rooms and making sure there was always warm water ready at the hour the madam woke in the night. Weeks later, when the pregnancy was confirmed and the announcement was made, Madame Su Yen Min called Rachel into the sitting room and looked at her steadily for a very long moment. "You already knew," she said. It was not a question. Rachel said nothing. The madam said, "Good." And after that, something between them changed. It was not friendship, not exactly. It was something older and quieter than friendship. It was trust at the level where trust costs something. Min Jun-won was born on a rainy Wednesday in April, and Rachel was the first person to hold him outside the delivery room because the nurses handed him to the nearest set of steady hands and Rachel's hands had always been steady. He was small and dark-haired and furious about being in the world, and he screamed at full volume for 4 minutes until Rachel pressed him against her chest and began humming something low and rhythmic from the part of her memory where her own mother lived, and he went quiet so abruptly that the nurse checked to make sure he was still breathing. He was breathing. He was simply listening. Rachel looked down at that small, still face and felt something settle inside her chest the way heavy furniture settles into place when it finally finds the right position. She said nothing. She handed him carefully to his mother. But Madame Su Yen Min had watched from the bed, and the look on her face then was one Rachel would think about for the rest of her life. The years after Minjun's birth were the fullest of Rachel's time in the one household. He was a serious child, not cold but careful, with his mother's observant eyes and a quality of stillness that sat strangely on a small boy. He followed Rachel through the house with the focused loyalty of a very young person who has decided to trust someone absolutely and is not interested in revising that decision. He learned to say her name before he could say most Korean words correctly. She taught him to count in both languages, sitting on the kitchen floor in the evenings with bottle caps arranged in rows between them. She read to him from whatever books were available. She told him stories from home, the old ones, the ones her grandmother had told her, and he listened with an intensity that made her feel like those stories mattered more than she had realized. She taught him that the strongest people in any room are usually the ones who speak last. He remembered that. The trouble with the Jukdo Brotherhood had been building for years by the time it finally arrived. Rachel knew this not because anyone told her but because the silences in the household grew longer and the security at the gate tripled overnight and Madame Su Yen Min stopped sleeping properly. She began checking the locks herself after the household staff had gone to bed. One night Rachel found her standing at the top of the stairs at 2 in the morning, perfectly dressed, perfectly still, looking at nothing. "There's going to be a dinner," the madam said without turning around. "A peace dinner. I've told them not to go." She paused. "They won't listen to me." She turned and looked at Rachel then, and the look on her face made the hair on Rachel's arms stand up, because Madame Su Yen Min was not a woman who showed fear, and what Rachel was looking at was not fear exactly. It was the expression of a person who knows exactly what is coming and cannot stop it. "Whatever happens," the madam said quietly, "you protect my son. Before anything else. Promise me." Rachel said, "I promise you, madam." And she meant it the way you can only mean something when the weight of it has already settled into your bones before the words come out. Minjun was 6 years old on the night the Jukdo Brotherhood came. Rachel heard it first. She was always a light sleeper, another gift from the years of being invisible in other people's houses, the hyper-awareness of someone who has learned to read environments before environments read them. She heard the sound before she understood it, a low percussive wrongness somewhere below, and then she was already moving, because her body had made the decision while her mind was still catching up. She went for Minjun's room first. That had always been the plan, not a plan anyone had spoken aloud but the plan that lived in her hands and feet when it mattered. She found him awake, sitting up in bed with his eyes very wide, and she had him in her arms and was moving toward the hidden panel in the back of his wardrobe before he could say anything. Madame Su Yen Min had shown her that passage years ago, on a quiet afternoon, while Minjun slept. "Just in case," she had said. Rachel had memorized every step of it. They went through darkness and cold stone and the sound of things happening in the house behind them that Rachel would not let herself hear clearly, because she needed to keep moving and she needed to keep moving, and she could feel Minjun's heartbeat against her collarbone where he had buried his face, and she kept her hand pressed over his ear on the side that faced back toward the house. She kept humming that low rhythmic thing, the same one that had quieted him the night he was born. She felt him try not to cry, and she felt the exact moment when he decided not to cry, and she thought, with the part of her mind that kept working even in the worst moments, that this boy was made of something very dense and very durable, and that whatever was going to become of him would not be small. They came out through a drainage grate at the back of the property, into the cold wet air of an April night, and Rachel ran. The months that followed were the hardest of her life, and she had not lived an easy one. She moved them carefully, methodically, the way you move something very fragile through a dangerous space. She could not go home. The agreement she had signed meant nothing now, but also meant that she could not surface anywhere that could be traced back. She found work under borrowed identities, night cleaning shifts in office buildings and hotel laundries where no one asked questions of a quiet woman who showed up on time and kept her eyes down. She enrolled Minjun in school using papers that a man she paid everything she had helped her obtain, and she sat with him every night over his homework, and she did not let him fall behind. She taught him the things the school did not teach. How to read a room. How to know who in a space was watching and who was genuinely indifferent. How to keep your face very still when information was coming at you that you needed time to process. How to wait. They moved 4 times in 3 years. Each time the reason was different, and each time Rachel had felt the change coming before it arrived. She never explained to Minjun exactly why they were moving. She simply said it was time, and he looked at her with those careful eyes and nodded. He did not ask questions she had not offered answers to. She had taught him that too. By the time he was 13, Minjun had grown taller than her shoulder and had developed the particular quality of stillness that very dangerous people sometimes have, the kind that is not passivity but the opposite of it, the stillness of someone who is always choosing how to move. That year, a man named Oh Sung-jin found them. He had been his father's personal driver, one of the few who had survived the night of the massacre because he had been away from the house on an errand, and he had been looking for Minjun for 7 years. He sat across from Rachel in the small apartment they were living in then and told her what he knew and what he had heard and what he believed was possible. Rachel listened to every word. When he finished, she looked at Minjun, who had been sitting in the corner with his homework out but had not looked at the homework once since the man came in. "What do you think?" she said. Minjun looked at her for a long moment. "I think he's telling the truth," he said. "And I think it's time to start learning the things I'll need." Rachel looked at Oh Sung-jin. "Whatever he learns," she said, "he learns properly. No shortcuts. No rage. Rage makes you predictable." Oh Sung-jin nodded slowly. "You've been raising him alone for 7 years," he said, not quite a question. "Yes," Rachel said. He looked at her then the way people sometimes looked at her, with something that tried to find a category for her and couldn't. "Then he's already learned the most important thing," the man said. Rachel picked up her tea and didn't answer, because she was not in the habit of accepting compliments from people she had only just met. The years between 13 and 26 were Minjun's years of becoming. Rachel watched it happen with the particular complicated feeling of someone who has grown something and understands that growing things eventually grow beyond the hand that planted them. He was precise, relentless, patient in a way that the people training him found unsettling, because patience in someone that young usually means one of 2 things, and they were only just beginning to understand which one they were dealing with. He absorbed everything. Languages, security protocols, the history and structure of the Chongpa syndicate and every rival faction. He learned to fight and then learned to strategize around fighting. He learned to read financial structures and contracts and the pressure points where power is actually held versus where it merely appears to be. Through all of it, he came back to Rachel. Not every night, not every week, but regularly, consistently, the way people return to the thing that anchors them. He still sat on her kitchen floor sometimes, the way he had as a child. He was well over 6 feet by now, and the sight of him folded against her cabinet with a bowl of the egusi soup she had learned to make in Seoul because he had loved it since childhood was something that made her chest hurt in the good way. He still told her things he did not tell anyone else. And she still told him the truth when everyone else was telling him what he wanted to hear. By the time Min Jun-won was 26, the Champa syndicate had spent 20 years being dismantled and absorbed and feared from a distance. The Jukdo Brotherhood under Kwon Dae-sung had taken most of the territory and most of the loyalty and felt secure in the assumption that the one heir was either dead or irrelevant. This was their critical error, and it came from underestimating the patience of a man raised by someone who understood that the deepest water makes the least noise. What happened in the 14 days that the underworld would later call the quiet weeks was not loud. It did not involve battles or announcements or visible declarations of war. It involved a series of very precise, very deliberate dismantlings, each one positioned so that the next one became inevitable. Oh Sung-jin had spent years rebuilding the network of loyalists who had gone underground after the massacre. Min Jun spent those 14 days activating them, one by one, at exactly the right moment in exactly the right order. By the end of the second week, the Brotherhood's leadership structure had collapsed from the inside. Kwon Dae-sung was removed. The Champa syndicate's control was reclaimed. The men who had spent 20 years loyal to a dead family and a lost heir learned that the heir was neither. Seoul's underworld did not celebrate this. It went very quiet and sat very still, the way spaces go quiet when something newly powerful has entered them and everyone is trying to calibrate their position. Min Jun-won became, almost overnight, the most feared man in the city's criminal architecture. He was cold in public, precise, never cruel without purpose, and he operated with the kind of controlled authority that made people feel watched even when he wasn't in the room. But there were things about him that only a very few people knew. He still called Rachel every 3 days without fail. He still sent her money long before she asked, consistently, accurately, knowing what her actual needs were because he paid attention to everything she said and many things she did not. He had her in an apartment in a quiet district, a good apartment, with good locks and a small garden at the back where she had planted things. He had people watching without her knowing, because he understood that her knowing would make her feel surveilled in the home she had earned, and her peace mattered to him more than his ease. He visited often, always with food from the restaurant near her first apartment, the one he remembered from when he was 15 and she had taken him there for his birthday because they could almost afford it. He sat across from her at her small table in his expensive suits and he ate the way he had always eaten with her, without performance, and she talked to him about her garden and the woman next door and the book she was reading, and he listened the way he had always listened to her, completely, the way a person listens when the speaker is the truest thing in their world. He never told her everything about his work. She never asked. But she knew. She had always known. And she loved him anyway, this boy she had carried through darkness, this man who now made powerful people afraid. She loved him in the specific, unglamorous way that you love someone whose entire origin story lives inside your body, someone you once kept alive by the sheer insistence of your own heartbeat. It was on an ordinary afternoon in March that the thing happened that changed everything again. Rachel was 61. She had not thought of herself as old because she did not have time for that particular vanity, but she was aware of being tired in the bone-deep way that does not respond to sleep. She was in the market near her apartment, the one where the ajumma who sold herbs always gave her extra because they had been exchanging recipes for 2 years and had developed the kind of wordless understanding that crosses language when the interest is genuine. She was walking back with 2 heavy bags, taking the shorter route through the side street, which she did most days and therefore should not have done that day. There were 3 of them. They knew her name. They said it first, the way people say a name to make sure you know this is not random, this is specific, this is a message. The message was for Min Jun-won. The man who had ordered it was Kwak Hyuk-soo, Kwon Dae-sung's nephew, the last significant piece of the Brotherhood's leadership still operational, who had spent 3 months locating the one person in Min Jun-won's life who was not surrounded by guards and loyalty oaths and armored glass. Rachel survived. This is important to say first. She survived because she was not fragile, had never been fragile, and because the fight in her was a different kind of fight than the one her attackers expected. She survived because a shopkeeper heard the sound and came out shouting before they were finished. She survived because she had spent her whole life knowing how to endure what could not be stopped and remain functional on the other side. She sat in the hospital for 6 hours before she called anyone. She had stitches in 2 places and a fractured rib and bruising that would take weeks to fade. She sat in the white hospital light and she thought about the promise she had made on a staircase 25 years ago, and she thought about the boy she had carried through darkness and the man he had become, and she thought about what telling him this would do to him. She thought about rage. About what happened when the thing that kept someone's worst impulses in check was the one thing you could not protect. She thought about all of this for 6 hours, and then she thought, I am 61 years old and I raised him to face the truth, and I will not be the one who lies to protect him from it. She picked up the phone. Minjun arrived in 40 minutes. This was, factually, not possible given the distance from his building to the hospital. She did not ask how he had managed it. He came through the door and stopped when he saw her, and the thing that crossed his face in that single unguarded second before the mask came down was something she had never seen there before in all the years she had been watching his face. It was not rage. It was something beneath rage, older and rawer, the expression of a person looking at the most terrifying thing they have ever seen, which was someone they could not bear to lose, telling them without words that they had already come very close. He sat beside her bed and he took her hand carefully, the way you take hold of something very carefully when you are afraid of hurting it more. He did not speak for a long time. His jaw was very tight. His eyes were on her face and they did not move. Tell me, he said finally, everything. In order. She told him. She told him about the market and the side street and what they had said. She told him the name they had given, Kwak Hyuk Soo, because Minjun needed the truth and she was done making decisions for him about what he could handle. When she finished, he was still. The kind of still she had taught him, which meant something very large and very controlled was happening underneath it. I should have had people with you, he said. His voice was absolutely level. That was the most frightening thing about it. You did, she said. I know about the people watching the building. His eyes moved to hers. Then they failed me. They protected my feeling of having a home of my own, Rachel said. I would not have had that if I'd known. You were giving me that on purpose and I knew it, and I let you because I needed it. He was quiet for a moment. I made you a target. You were always going to be a target for people who had lost to you, she said. That is the world you are in. The question is what you do now. He looked at her for a very long time. The machines beside her beeped quietly. Somewhere down the corridor, someone was crying softly, the private kind of crying. What I do now, Minjun said, will not be proportional. I know, Rachel said. I'm not asking you to be proportional. I'm asking you to be intentional. Rage and intention are different things. You know this. I taught you this. He exhaled. It was a slow, controlled exhale that she recognized as the thing he did when he was choosing his nature over his instinct. Yes, he said. You taught me this. He pressed her hand very gently. Rest. I'll be back in the morning. He stood. At the door he paused with his back to her, and she could see by the set of his shoulders exactly what was happening in him. Rachel, he said without turning. It was the only time in 25 years he had ever called her by her first name without the formal title she had earned. Her chest tightened. I know, she said quietly. He left. Within 48 hours, every man Kwak Hyuk Soo had operating in the city had been removed. Not killed, because Min Jun had listened to what she told him about intentionality, but removed so decisively and completely that the operational meaning was the same. Kwak Hyuk Soo himself was brought before Min Jun's counsel, and the conversation that took place there was brief and the outcome was absolute, and no one who had been in that room spoke about it afterward. The Brotherhood's last functioning piece became completely non-functional. It was done with no excess and no announcement, and the message that reached every relevant ear in Seoul's underworld required no words at all. The story should have ended there, quietly, with Rachel recovering in her apartment with her garden outside and Min Jun arriving every other day with food from the same restaurant, checking on her stitches and sitting across from her at the small table with the careful, present quality of someone who has understood that the ordinary moments are the ones you cannot afford to take as ordinary. But something had shifted between them. Nothing that changed what they were to each other. But something that was finally being named, in the particular wordless way that the most important truths get named between people who have shared too much to need language for all of it. A journalist named Park Sunha published a story 6 weeks after the hospital. She had been following Min Jun's rise for 2 years, the way investigative journalists follow figures who exist at the edge of what can be publicly documented, and in doing so she had found the thread of Rachel Adeozobi, the Nigerian woman who had been with the one household before the massacre, and whose name appeared in records connected to Min Jun's enrolled identities in his adolescent years. The piece she published was careful and sourced, and it did not say the things that could not be legally said, but what it did do was put a photograph of Rachel on the front page of a widely read news platform with a headline that translated to something like "The Woman Behind the Air," and a story that, while incomplete, gave enough that the people who needed to understand what Rachel Adeozobi had done for Min Jun could understand it. Rachel read the article at her kitchen table on a Thursday morning with her tea going cold beside her, and she sat with it for a long time. She had spent 35 years being invisible, and she had chosen that invisibility in many ways, not from shame but from survival and from the understanding that the safest knowledge was the knowledge you pretended not to have. Being visible felt strange and exposing, and also, in a way she had not expected, like putting down something very heavy that you had been carrying so long you had forgotten it was weight. Min Jun arrived that same evening. He had a folder under his arm and the expression on his face that meant he had been thinking carefully and was ready to tell her what he had decided. He sat down across from her and placed the folder on the table. Inside were documents. Property documents. A deed for a house, a proper house, in a quiet neighborhood to the south of the city, with a garden that was 3 times the size of the one she had now and a kitchen that faced east so it would have morning light, which he knew she preferred because she had mentioned it once in passing 4 years ago and he had held on to it the way he held on to everything she said. There was also a security plan, detailed and unobtrusive, the kind that would give her genuine safety without the feeling of being watched. There was a letter in Korean and English that he had clearly written himself, because the phrasing was his, and it was one of the most formally beautiful things Rachel had ever read, not because of the language but because of what the language was trying to carry, which was everything he owed her, and his full understanding that there was not an amount or a word or a house that was equal to it, but that he was going to spend the rest of his life trying anyway. She read all of it while he sat across from her and waited, his hands folded on the table, perfectly still. When she finished, she set the letter down and looked at him for a very long moment, this man who was feared by people who feared almost nothing, who ran one of the most powerful criminal structures in the country, who had walked into a room of armed men and had them remove themselves by the sheer force of what he was willing to do, who ate her soup on her kitchen floor and called her every 3 days and had memorized what she preferred. She looked at him and he looked back at her, and the weight of everything they had been to each other sat between them, heavy and real and true in the way that only things earned over decades can be true. "Min Jun," she said. "Yes," he said. "I don't need this house to know that you love me," she said. "I know," he said. "I need it to know that I know," he said. There was a long pause. Then "Yes," Rachel said. "All right." She moved into the house in May. The garden was everything he had promised. She planted things she had been wanting to plant for years, things that took time and that she had not let herself start because she had not trusted the permanence of any space she had inhabited since leaving Lagos. Now she planted them. She planted things that would take 3 years to reach their full height, which was a statement. The way choosing to grow something slow is always a statement about your belief in your own future. Min Jun came on Sundays when his schedule allowed and sometimes when it did not, and he sat in the garden while she worked and he told her things he was deciding and she asked the questions that helped him find the answer he already knew. Nothing between them had changed. Everything was more settled than it had ever been. On a Sunday in October, the 1-year anniversary of the hospital, Min Jun arrived with the food from the same restaurant and they ate at the garden table in the late afternoon light, and the conversation drifted the way it always did between them, through small things and then the larger things underneath them. Rachel asked about a woman she had heard him mention twice in the past months, a careful mentioning, the kind that happens when someone is holding something close. She asked with the directness she had always used with him because he had never needed to be protected from honesty. He was quiet for a moment. He set down his chopsticks. He told her, with the careful precision of a man who chooses his words because he understands that words are the most powerful things most people possess, that there was a woman and that what he felt was not familiar to him and it concerned him in the way that unfamiliar things concern careful people. Rachel listened to everything. When he finished, she asked what the woman's name was and whether she made him want to be honest with her, because that was always the question that mattered. He was quiet for a moment and then he said yes, both things. Rachel nodded. Then stop being slow about it, she said. You are not a slow man by nature. Stop performing slowness. He looked at her for a moment and then he laughed, sudden and real, and it was the laugh she had heard since he was 6 years old and it sounded exactly the same. The woman's name was Jisoo Lim and she was a private architect who had been brought in to oversee a renovation project connected to one of Min Jun's legitimate properties, and she had walked into his office on a February morning and within 4 minutes had told him, clearly and without apology, that the design brief she had been given contained 3 structural impossibilities and she would need to revise it completely, and she hoped he did not pay people to simply agree with him because that would make this a short professional relationship. He had stared at her. He could not remember the last time someone had talked to him like that in a professional context. It was so startling that it had taken him a full 5 seconds to formulate a response, and he had spent a significant part of those 5 seconds thinking about Rachel, because Jisoo Lim talked the way Rachel talked and held the ground the way Rachel held the ground and looked at him with the kind of eyes that were not interested in who he was publicly, only in what he was actually saying. He had hired her for 3 more projects by April. He knew exactly what he was doing. She was less certain what she was doing, which was characteristic of her. Jisoo Lim was extremely certain about architecture and somewhat less certain about the emotional architecture of her own decisions, but she knew that Min Jun won, for all his coldness in rooms full of other people, was never cold with her, and that he listened when she talked the way people rarely listened, and that he had appeared in her office 3 times with food from a restaurant she had mentioned once in passing as her favorite. She noticed things. She was an architect. Noticing things was the job. The first time he told her he loved her was not planned. They were standing in the framework of an unfinished building she was overseeing, concrete and steel around them, the city visible through the open walls, and she was explaining why the load-bearing decisions mattered and what happened to beautiful things when you built them on the wrong foundation, and he had stood there listening with his hands in his pockets and his face in that arrangement it went into when she was talking, and somewhere in the middle of her explanation he had said, quietly and completely seriously, I love you. I want you to know that I am saying it now because I mean it precisely and not as a beginning to something transactional. I'm not asking anything. I simply wanted you to know. Jisoo had stopped mid-sentence. She stood in the unfinished building in the October afternoon light and looked at him for a long time. He looked back. That is the most structurally honest thing anyone has ever said to me, she said finally. I know, he said. I was raised by someone who believed in structural honesty. She had heard enough about Rachel Adia's Obi by then to understand exactly what that meant. She told him she loved him back 3 weeks later in the parking structure outside his main office building because she had been thinking about it for 3 weeks and had finally decided that the structural honesty went both ways. He had been walking to his car and she had been standing by hers and she had said it across the distance between them without preamble, just the thing itself, clearly, the way she said things. He had stood very still for a moment and then walked to her and taken her face in both hands and looked at her for a long time before he kissed her, careful and complete, the way a person kisses someone when they are fully present in the moment and not thinking about anything else. He brought her to meet Rachel in November, on a rainy Sunday afternoon, which was perhaps not the most auspicious timing, but they had not planned it. They had simply been in the neighborhood and Min Jun had said, "Would you come?" and Jisoo had said yes. Rachel opened the door and looked at Jisoo with the same kind of steady, complete attention she brought to all important things, and Jisoo, who was not easily unsettled, felt very seen. They sat in the kitchen and drank tea and Rachel asked Jisoo questions that were not small talk, they were the real questions, the ones about what she valued and what she believed and what she was willing to be honest about. Jisoo answered all of them directly. About 40 minutes in, Rachel made more tea without asking, and that, Min Jun understood, was the verdict. Later, walking to the car, Jisoo said, "She's extraordinary." "Yes," Minjun said. "She raised you," Jisoo said. "She saved me," Minjun said. "Both times." Jisoo looked at him. She understood there was a distinction he was drawing between the literal saving of a life and the ongoing, daily, continuous work of keeping a person's soul intact, and she understood that both of those things were true about Rachel Adeozobi. "I hope I get to know her," Jisoo said. "You will," Minjun said. "She likes you." "How do you know?" He smiled very slightly. "She made more tea." He proposed in the house with the east-facing garden, in January, on a Sunday afternoon while Rachel was weeding and Jisoo had come with him and Minjun had simply, quietly, in Rachel's presence, taken out the ring and asked. Jisoo said yes and then immediately said, "Why did you do this here?" And he said, "Because this is where I do the important things. This is home." Rachel sat back on her heels and looked at the two of them and said nothing for a moment and then said, in Yoruba, the phrase her own grandmother had used when something good and true and hard-won had finally arrived, and Minjun, who had been hearing her Yoruba his whole life, understood enough to bow his head slightly in acknowledgement. Jisoo, who did not understand Yoruba, understood from the tone and the tears in Rachel's eyes that something very old and very right was being said, and she reached out and took Rachel's earth-stained hand and held it. They married in the spring, a small ceremony, private in the way that Minjun arranged everything that mattered to him, carefully and without performance. Rachel sat in the front, the position of family, because she was family in every way that the word deserved to be used. She wore the deep green that Minjun knew she preferred, and she had her hair done at the salon in the neighborhood where she knew the owner, and she held herself with the particular dignity of someone who is paid for everything they are with their actual life and therefore has no need to perform it. When the officiant asked who had helped form this man into someone capable of this moment, Minjun turned and looked at Rachel, directly, in front of everyone, in the clear afternoon light, and said her name. Just that. Just Rachel Adeozobi. And the room was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when a truth is told that is too large for any other sound to sit beside it. 3 months after the wedding, Jisoo told Minjun in the kitchen of their apartment on a Tuesday morning, with her tea in both hands and her hair not yet done and the ordinary light of a Tuesday morning coming through the window, that she was pregnant. He stood across from her and did not speak for a full 10 seconds and then crossed the kitchen and took the tea out of her hands and held them, both of them, and looked at her face for a long time. "Are you all right?" he said finally. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He thought about Rachel carrying someone else's child through darkness with her hands pressed over his ears. He thought about bottle caps on a kitchen floor and stories from someone's grandmother and a promise made on a staircase that was kept across 25 years without faltering once. He thought about what it meant to give someone a beginning that was worth having. "I'm very all right," he said quietly. "I know exactly what this is supposed to look like." They called Rachel that same evening. She answered on the second ring, which was her custom, and Minjun said, "There is going to be a child," and Rachel was quiet for a moment, just a moment, and then she said, "I'll plant something new tomorrow. Something that will take a long time to grow." It was, for anyone who knew her, the most complete and beautiful thing she could have said. And somewhere in Seoul, in a house with an east-facing kitchen and a garden that believed in the future, a woman who had carried a frightened boy through darkness and kept every promise she had ever made sat with her tea and her seeds and the full knowledge that she had not just survived her life. She had built something inside it that would outlast her. Something that had a name and wore expensive suits and called her every 3 days and still, sometimes, sat on her kitchen floor. Something that now had a wife who made more tea when it mattered and a child coming in the spring who would learn to count in 2 languages on the kitchen floor, as all important children should. The black woman was beaten unaware she raised the Korean Mafia boss whom they all feared. And what the title does not say, because titles are always too small for the truth, is what she also raised alongside the Mafia boss. She raised the man. And the man was the harder, more important, and more lasting thing. That's it for today, besties. If you made it this far, if Rachel and Minjun's story moved something in you, please like this video right now and subscribe so you never miss another story on Unfold Korean Stories. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from and what moment hit you the hardest. Was it Rachel running through that passage? Was it the tea? Was it him turning and saying her name? I want to know. Share this with someone who needs a story about love that costs something real and survives anyway. I'll see you in the next one. Stay blessed.